Good evening, and welcome to the second evening keynote of the Smithsonian's Claiming Space Symposium, co-organized by the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum, National Museum of African American History and Culture, and National Museum of African Art. I'm Matt Schindel, Space History Curator from the National Air and Space Museum, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's keynote and introduce our special guest for the evening. But first, I want to say just a few quick thank yous. Thank you to the Smithsonian's Year of Music Committee, who provided the funding for our first event back in 2019, and to the Smithsonian Secretary, Lonnie Bunch, and Smithsonian leadership for their continued support. And thank you to my fellow members of the Afrofuturism Working Group who organized this symposium, Kevin DeMichelle, Karen Milbourne, Michelle Joan Wilkinson, and Kevin Strait. And thank you to Katie Moyer and Sophia Soto Sugar for their incredible work behind the scenes to bring this idea to life, and to our interns, Mariana Zuniga and Lydia Caldwell. So tonight's keynote is Sonic Space, and it's a real pleasure to introduce tonight's special guest because I remember being 13 years old, watching him take over the Saturday Night Live stage back in 1989 and being just blown away with his performance. So, London-born American guitarist, composer, founder of Living Colour, and co-founder of the Black Rock Coalition, Vernon Reid has done a great deal to undermine stereotypical expectations of what kinds of music Black artists ought to play. His rampant eclecticism encompasses everything from hard rock and punk to funk, R&B, and avant-garde jazz, and his anarchic, lightning-fast solos have become a hallmark. In 1980, he joined Ronald Shannon Jackson's Decoding Society, and over the course of the decade, Reid went on to work with a wide variety of experimental musicians. You're going to get to know him tonight, and I'm going to hand things over now to my colleague Kevin Strait, curator at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. Enjoy.
Thanks, Matt, and thanks everyone for tuning in tonight. Not sure if Vernon's on the screen yet. There he is. Hi, Vernon. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm very good, thank you. I'm so happy to have this chance to speak with you about music, your work, your career, your influences, and pretty much anything else that comes to mind.
Right on.
I'd love to start off hearing about your influences and maybe some of your earliest musical memories. What was some of the music that, or some of the first music that you picked up on?
Well, you know, I'm, what is that? I was born in London, as most people know, and my parents were part, you know, people talk about the Great Migration from the American South to the Midwest and to the West and to the industrialized cities. And there was a parallel migration in the Caribbean, where people from all the various islands, the Francophone islands, the British islands, and the Latin influenced dominated colonial spaces. A lot of people in the 50s, actually post World War II, left their situations to seek opportunity. And they went to the mother countries. They went to the big cities. You know, they went to Paris. You know, they went to London. And my parents are from Montserrat. This island is part of the Leeward Islands, which is next to Antigua. It's a line of islands that ends in Cuba. And they, as young people, they went to London. And they went there because, you know, they'd heard that there was opportunity there. And there was for a time, and there had been a lot of people had been requested to come to the colonial countries to rebuild them after World War II. You know, London had been bombed to smithereens, and all the big cities had to be rebuilt. And that rebuilding went on from the end of the war all through the 50s. And my parents are part of a wave of people that left the Caribbean and went to some of the big Anglo cities. And there was, of course, a backlash, as there was in the northern industrial cities, as there was in Chicago and New York and LA, against the incursion of Africanized people. So they took a shot on America, and they got married. They were really young, and they took a shot on America. So I was brought to the States when I was like 1.5 years old, and first we lived in Harlem, and then my father took us all to Brooklyn, and that was it. That was the beginnings. The thing about my parents is that they were very open-minded about music. I mean, they brought their records and their music, but they also were interested in, and mom was like the Dave Clark Five, and I remember when the Beatles came on the Ed Sullivan Show, and it was a pretty momentous thing.
I can imagine. What made you gravitate towards the guitar?
It was a funny thing. I was a big fan of Dionne Warwick. I just liked the way her voice sounded, and I remember the first time. I mean, I liked the guitar on records. Particularly, I heard guitar was prominent on James Brown records and a lot of the R&B records, a lot of the Motown records. But it was hearing Carlos Santana's cover of Black Magic Woman. It's actually, I think, Black Magic Woman was originally Peter Green to me, and it was hearing his guitar that it reminded me of Dionne Warwick's voice, and subsequently turns out that he was also a big fan of Dionne Warwick. And
sorry, just to get what you're saying, you're talking about the tone of her voice sort of matching the tone of his guitar, and that sort of speaking to you.
Yeah, his guitar sounded really vocal. His approach sounded very vocal to me, and I think Hendrix was over my head at first. I was too young. Interestingly enough, I was not. I was too young for a lot of the things that went on. The one thing I do remember is that the Beatles, how radically the Beatles changed from "I Want to Hold Your Hand" to "Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds." Right. And I remember thinking, I was kind of amazed that it was the same band, because of course they had been changing gradually the whole time, but Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds was so different than the band that was on Ed Sullivan. And I remembered thinking, man, that's so different for them. And I think I became vaguely aware of Hendrix. It wasn't until later, after his passing, that I really clued in on Hendrix in high school. In junior high, it was a little bit over my head.
Well, I guess, just thinking about some of your background, and you really started to study and explore the craft of guitar playing and music making, I guess in the 70s. And to think about that time period, there's such an abundance of enormous hits in the pop worlds of R&B and soul. But what started to emerge in funk and jazz in the 70s was that rock guitar sound. And you hear this music in the 70s sort of take off in new directions while taking its cues from electric guitar. And I guess to some degree, I'm thinking about Miles Davis's explorations too, and incorporating that electric guitar sound. How did those sounds start to influence you?
Well, I would say it was because I met really cool people. Like some people, their high school, my junior high school or middle school experience was my nightmare. But I had a great time in high school. I met some amazing musicians. I went to Brooklyn Tech, which is not a music. I think they have a music program now, but back then they didn't. It was strictly an after-school elective, and we had and in fact, that was my first experience of a Black male teacher. Was actually this teacher, Gene Gee. He was a great saxophonist, and he kind of came on his own time. He did the whole thing where he played records and talked about music, and he really played records back and forth. Like that was the first time I heard Coltrane was in this after school program. And I met, people that became really good friends to me. I met a drummer named Reggie Sylvester, who was really into prog progressive stuff. And he turned me on to Jack Bruce. He turned me on to Jack Bruce post Cream, because I remember Jack Bruce from Sunshine of Your Love and White Room. And I remember hearing those on AM radios. And really digging that. And I met great keyboard player Raymond Jones, who went on to just do all kinds of amazing things. And he was just a kind of maverick kid, and was really, he's just a unique person, and he influenced me a lot. And in fact, my friend Raymond played in the band Chic, and he in fact is playing the Rhodes part on Good Times, which is, a song that figures big in the history of hip hop. And I remember seeing, and he was
with the Sugar Hill Gang, or with the Sugar Hill session.
He was actually with Chic. He was with Chic, and in fact, I saw him play with Chic at the Beacon Theater, and that had a tremendous. He was like, he was 18, and I saw him on stage with like one of the biggest bands in the world, and he had a real struggle with his parents. He was dedicated to the piano, and he had huge ears, and he played gospel, he played jazz, he played R&B, but he turned me on to people like Peter Gabriel and Todd Rundgren. So I just had friends who were into all kinds of they opened my eyes to a lot of things, and I heard amazing musicians. I heard, like, to my ear, still the greatest improvising musician I've ever heard was a guy from Brooklyn named Arthur Rames, and he played in a battle of the bands with there's people might know this R&B singer named Miles J. Well, I went to high school with him, and he sounds kind of like Teddy Pendergrass. He's got one of those deep, sexy voices, and but he's an amazing flautist and violinist, and every year they had a battle of the bands, and they had a big auditorium, and he brought his band in, and I remember they were the finalists against a band called East, and they played Led Zeppelin and an Allman Brothers, and he brought this young guitar player playing like this kind of thin line F-hole Telecaster, and he was out of control. I mean, he was the highest level. My jaw was like, wow, and he's incredible. And of course, they lost to the band the other band because they played Whipping Post, which is ironic. They played a pretty good version of Whipping Post though, but they should have lost. But Miles was robbed, But yeah, the thing about it was, people existed in this kind of almost fantasy space, of being on records and coming out of the radio, and then that seemed unattainable and coming from another planet. But then we had local influences, local musicians who were mind-blowingly good. And it was around that time in the 70s that the Mahavishnu Orchestra, John McLaughlin, who played with Miles Davis, and he originally played with Tony Williams. And Tony Williams really deserves the credit for jazz fusion. To a certain degree, people could argue about Soft Machine from the UK, but people think that jazz fusion started with Miles Davis, and actually it starts with the record Tony Lifetime Emergency, with Larry Young on organ and John McLaughlin on guitar. And anyway, Miles hired John away from Tony, which Tony had played with Miles. So that's a kind of weird thing that happened. And he played on some seminal records. John McLaughlin plays on Bitches Brew. He plays on Live Evil. He plays on a tribute to Jack Johnson. And he eventually breaks out from Miles, and then he starts the Mahavishnu Orchestra. And hearing, the Intermounting Flame, it was like a life-changing thing. So like there were certain records that came along and just when Santana made Caravanserai, the Intermounting Flame, the Weather Report, I Sing the Body Electric, and then Mysterious Traveler, the first Return to Forever record. These were things. And at the same time, there's like the Band of Gypsies record, which was just insane. I mean that was record terrified me. It really incredible. That record had a huge impact on me, and it was a time when all of these great records. I mean, great records, but all different styles of music. That's like the Led Zeppelin records, and how Physical Graffiti comes out, and Houses of the Holy. Only incredible records of all different types of people.
Well, you mentioned your, I guess your relationship with Hendrix, and perhaps not being ready for him in terms of your first exposure to him. But I feel like guitarists of your generation, especially, have to sort of pass through the gauntlet of Jimi Hendrix, or at least kind of reckon with his influence. His impact was sort of like I guess like a sonic Big Bang, and that influence is just so broad.
Yeah, well, thinking about it, I mean, the charts were totally dominated by they called it the British invasion. And for a time, I mean, they kind of swept the previous rock and roll, from the 50s. They kind of, because it was weird, because it was like rock and roll from the 50s, then suddenly it was guys in tuxedos, and then the mop heads and, all these young British musicians started showing up, and, the Stones, the Beatles, the Kinks, the Who. I mean, just this raft of bands came through and were reshaping the whole thing. And in a way, it wasn't until sort of the San Francisco explosion, because there were things were happening in terms of R&B and the beginnings of funk, but it wasn't until, the San Francisco bands like the Jefferson Airplane and Jimi Hendrix. And Jimi Hendrix was like a one-man commando, in response to the British invasion. Right. And people weren't even, because he was in this kind of pressure cooker of playing in R&B bands and playing in rock and roll bands. He played with Richard Penniman, Little Richard. And most notably, he played with the Isley Brothers. And that's a very important connection, because there's a young Ernie Isley who becomes very influenced by this really cool dude who played with his older brothers. And it turns out that later on, it's Ernie Isley that really brings the Isley Brothers into their next phase of their careers. And they were dragged kicking and screaming by Ernie Isley, because he was an underling. He was the youngest brother. He plays bass on It's Your Thing. And I think he's like 11 or 12 when he plays bass on It's Your Thing. But basically he convinced them to cover one of their own tunes, because they had a song called Who's That Lady? But they did Who's That Lady as a bossa nova. They did that as part of the bossa nova explosion in the earlier part of the 60s. And it's Ernie Isley that dragged that tune out and turned it into a funk rock, black rock anthem. And that was really important, because in a way, the passing of Jimi Hendrix, he was such an anomaly, and in a weird way, it was almost like the door had sort of closed in mainstream rock towards against another Jimi Hendrix coming up. But what happened was the Isley Brothers kept that sound alive. On those tunes like Fight the Power, and Summer Breeze. They cover Summer Breeze, the brilliant cover of Summer Breeze.
That's the saying, when Ronald Isley takes a song, it's his forever.
Oh, right, 100. But they were, again, Ernie was like, they had that kind of hierarchy thing of the brothers, the older brothers rule the roost and what have you. And when I had a conversation with Ernie, and I think it was his dad that was like, you know what, he's got something. he kind of corralled them and said, man, he's got something. And it was really, really true. And then he redefined the direction, for the rest of that decade into the 80s.
I think it's fascinating how you can hear, those elements, that were sort of brought upon by Hendrix, and then you could hear it in, in the work of different guitarists across generations. And that broad influence of Hendrix, it's not just a virtuoso approach to playing, it's also the gear he helped popularize, using studio technology, effects pedals to shape his sound. You know, when you think about Afrofuturism in music, so much is about pure stylistic innovation and the creation of new musical futures, but also, you know, about these musical architects really establishing the templates for these new categories of music. So from Hendrix and later to Ernie Isley, to Eddie Hazel, to Pete Cozy and jazz and others, you know, that Hendrix influence is just so profound in terms of shaping the field.
Absolutely, and you know, and trailblazers like Sonny Chirac and James Blood Omer. You know, the thing about Hendrix was also the way he. It was the way he lived. It was the way he occupied space. It was his being. His guitar emanated out of his being. I remember him on the Dick Cavett show, and Dick Cavett was notorious for kind of cornering his guests and trying to one up them, and you know, it was almost like a weird competition. You know what I mean? Like, you know, him and Gore Vidal kind of doing their thing, whatever. And Jimi Hendrix came on. He's wearing this brilliant blue kimono, and he sits down, and Dick Cavett says, "Well, I hear you're the greatest guitarist in the world." And Jimmy, like without a beat, he goes, "Well, I'm the greatest guitarist in this chair." It's brilliant. I mean, there was no, he went right back, you know, it's like that slap in the heat of the night, you know, there was a slap that was heard around the cinematic world, you know, it was this moment, and he just took this particular moment. And that was the other thing about Hendrix's influence is funny because there's such, because he was so iconic and so influential, there's a trap of falling into trying to be him, which, and I'm not really talking about being influenced by his playing, because, you know, his influence is inescapable. And there are many brilliant guitarists like Robin Trower, you know, obviously Stevie Ray Vaughan, that have taken that influence and kept their personalities. You know, they took the influence. Like Stevie Ray Vaughan is amazing because you can clearly hear the influence of Albert King and Jimi Hendrix, but he mainly sounds like Stevie Ray Vaughan, and that's kind of an incredible feat. You know, so the thing about Hendrix, and just like musicians like a Coltrane, you know, the kind of lesson is really be yourself, and that's a risky proposition. You know, you may not, you know, I mean, they were iconic within their lifetimes, and you know, if you follow your own star, you know, the people may not get it. You know, they may not get it. It's like people are only starting to really get Sonny Chirac. I mean, you know, certain luminaries like Larry Coryell really respected Sonny Chirac from the top. But now, and you know, thanks to this movie Summer of Soul, you know, people are saying, man, that cat is, you know, he you know, playing with Herbie Mann, he's blowing the guitar up really, and taking it from another, you know, just his presence on the instrument, let more than, you know, like, and James Blood Omer has this too. He's not playing like hip lines or he's attacking the guitar from his perspective in the way that's uniquely his, and really, you know, there's no real rules, right? But we get put under rules because, you know, everybody, you know, this is impressive, that's impressive. It can pull you away from whoever you're becoming, and it is a becoming. You know, I think it's a thing that has to happen over a long period of time, and you know, that's a challenge. But that's really, I think, the most important thing about these incredible singers, musicians. You know, you have to find your own voice, and that can be lonely. You know, if people don't get it, you know, like people didn't get Franz Kafka, right? Like Franz Kafka, the people didn't get, you know, a lot of art. They didn't get Van Gogh. You know, the only person that got Van Gogh was his brother Theo. You know, the only person that got Kafka was his friend Max. And Kafka said Kafka went to Max and said, "Yo, I want you to burn all my nonsense." And he was like, "Oh my God, You know, that's the movie. The movie is really more about Max. You know what I mean? Because Kafka was like, man, I ruined everything. I messed up, and you know, and he redefined writing as we know it. But people around it, they couldn't make head or tail of it. You know, like Ornette Coleman. You know, Ornette was a huge influence on Pat Metheny, big time. To Pat, you know, but when Ornette was coming up, man, he was people were sharply divided, very sharply divided about him. You know, and it was when when he started coming out, it was like, man, and people. But Freddie Hubbard, who was like the trumpet, like everybody after Miles, it was Freddie Hubbard. And Freddie Hubbard turned around and recorded with Ornette, you know, and put respect on his name. So, you know, it's an interesting thing about how these things, over time, there's a consensus and then everybody agrees. But a lot of the people that did amazing things, there was no consensus about them at the time.
It's interesting. Tell me about how you came to form Living Color with the other guys in the group. I know you had previously cut your teeth on jazz recordings, and you know you were coming out of the avant-garde jazz fusion sound from Decoding Society and playing with Ronald Shannon Jackson, those amazing musicians. All those elements seemed to fuse into what became Living Color, but Living Color, of course, had its own musical and visual approach. What brought you guys together, but also what were you guys essentially trying to achieve, musically speaking?
Well, it was a complete. I mean, it was a journey. It was like a journey, and I mean, the thing when I think about how Living Color came to be, it was a bunch of reversals, and it was a lot of disappointments and weird things. And you know, I was in an R&B group. You know, I had tried to do a little fusion group, and I had met these guys who were really brilliant. This drummer named Greg Barrett, bass player named Melvin Gibbs, keyboard player named Derek Baines, and we used to rehearse on Eastern Parkway, you know, in Greg's basement. And we had like 1 or 2 gigs. It didn't really, you know, and didn't know what I was doing. And we eventually kind of separated. And then, you know, I was into all this weirdo music, and I decided, you know, I'm just gonna give all this. I'm gonna play it straight, right? So I met a drummer named Buddy, and he started working with this great songwriter named Kashif, and Kashif had just left BT Express, and BT Express is interesting because BT Express had a sax player named Carlos Ward, and Carlos Ward played with John Coltrane, and Carlos Ward played, I think, on Ascension, and you know, I mean, and Carlos Ward was interesting because he was a heavyweight cat, but he was totally happy playing inside of BT Express. You know, he could modulate his thing, right? But he was an incredible horn player. Anyway, Kashif was a prolific songwriter. He had a bunch of tunes, and he put together this. I got kind of brought in by this neighborhood drummer named Buddy. He was a real hip dude, played great. You know, he was into Miles and stuff. But you know, it's a long, crazy story. All that to say that I got in this band, and I bumped heads immediately with Kashif about what is and what isn't Black music. Like we, you know, and you know, I never gave up being into rock music, or I mean, I was into rock, I was into funk, I'm a cumulative type of person. I'm weird in that my tastes are like, I'll like something, but it doesn't negate what I liked previously. So finding Ornette Coleman didn't negate my love for James Brown or Kool and the Gang. You know, it just became another thing, another sound that and I give that a lot of credit to my parents, because my parents never told me you shouldn't listen to that because that's white boy music, or that's noise. My parents were just like, turn it down. You know,
it's a little loud, turn it down. So, I'm listening to Machine Gun on the family type, I was literally in my basement with the lights turned off, playing Machine Gun, which alarmed my mother, no doubt. And anyway, so I was developed this kind of cumulative, what I call a cumulative aesthetic. And I bumped heads with Kashif because he was very narrowly focused about what is and what's in and what's out of R&B music. What Black people listen to, what they won't listen to. And I'm not going to say he's totally wrong, but we had a huge out. There was one rehearsal where we had this brilliant percussionist named Eric Guest, right? And Eric was he was a beast. And we were doing this tune and his percussion break, and he pulled out these go-go bells, right? And he started playing these go-go bells with Buddy. It was incredible. It was smoking. And then Kashif stopped the band. He stopped the band, and he said, "Don't play those. It's too ethnic." And I was like, "Whoa, what? Like a cowbell's not ethnic?" It was a weird moment, So yeah, so we were headed for a crash, and I got we had answering machines back in the day, and both myself and Buddy got fired or via answering machine, and which was fine by me. And then I got a phone call, and at this point I was living away from home. I was living in Park Slope, and I got a phone call from Melvin, and we stayed in touch and stay close. And he said, "You've got to hear this drummer I'm playing with." And Melvin was kind of a maverick too. He was like, because we were all local dudes that stayed in Brooklyn. You know what I mean? And he was like, "I'm playing with this drummer, at this club in the city. You got to come check him out." So I went, and that's the first time I heard Ronald Shannon Jackson. The first time I heard him, and it was his music was so odd, and I couldn't define what it was. It was jazz, but it wasn't like Coltrane's jazz. It wasn't like Miles's jazz. It wasn't even like Ornette's music. It was it was kind of had blues in it, but it was really strange. He had Eastern stuff going on, and I was mesmerized, And I went and on my own, I went to see Shannon play with James Blood Omer and David Murray and Amin Ali, and this was at Joe's Pub when Ntozake Shange, they had jazz at it was actually not Joe's Pub, it was Jazz at the Public. That's what it was. Joe's Pub came later on. It was Jazz at the Public, and that was kind of put together by Ntozake Shange because Joe Papp had produced for Color Girls. Considered Suicide When the Rainbow Is Enough. So there's all of this overlap between theater and dance, and so that's how it was Jazz at the Public, and that's how I heard just so many wonderful. That's how I heard Henry Threadgill and Air, and all these incredible. That's the first time I heard Oliver Lake. First time I heard Michael Gregory on guitar. I mean, just incredible group. But I saw him play with James Blood Omer. First time I heard James Blood Omer. It was kind of a mind-blowing experience. And I walked up to Shannon and said, "Oh, man, you're so great. I met you. I'm Melvin's friend." And then I got a phone call and said, Shannon said to come to this address and bring a guitar. And, I showed up and we did this little jam. And he said, "Be here next Tuesday." and that was, it wasn't like, you're hired. It's like, "Be here next Tuesday." And that was the beginning of my real professional life. I mean, the first time, I actually, in the introduction, it said that I actually started playing with Shannon in like 78 and 78 or 79. And then the first time I ever flew on an airplane, first time I got a passport, that was in 1980. And the first, it was wild, and my life kind of really started from there. And then I, hanging out with Melvin. Melvin was playing in both Decoding Society, started playing in this band Defunct, and I just hung out, and they used to play at this place, the Squat Theater on 23rd Street. And then, you know, just through hanging out, I became one of the alternate guitarists, you know. That's how I met Kelvin Bell, you know, and so many, you know, the incredible Marvin Horn, who's like ridiculous. I mean, people don't know he's one of the greatest jazz guitar players, you know. And I met the great Bill Bickford, and you know, all these wonderful people.
That's amazing, Vernon.
Yeah.
I want to be aware of the time because we're running out of it, and there's so much to get through. But
sorry, blah, blah,
oh, no problem at all. I mean, this is amazing. I want to ask you about Cult of Personality, and
sure.
you know, I had a similar reaction to what Matt was talking about. My first concert was the Steel Wheels tour.
Wow.
Where you guys opened, and Cult blew my mind as well. But you know, I'm still struck by how different Cult sounds. You know, as this fusion of like funk, alternative, metal, prog, and you know, that's just the song. It's not the corresponding visual of the video. You know, with you, Corey, and the guys having, you know, that fresh and vivid look. But you know, in an era of very fast soloing, your riff and your solo have this real kind of methodical approach. You know, that's a fusion of like controlled technique. When you were mentioning John McLaughlin, I sort of hear it in that vein, but it's also this explosion of sounds and notes that, you know, matches the content of the song. I was wondering if you could take us through that riff a little bit. You know,
yeah, sure. Let me see. Hopefully we won't blow out the speakers or whatever. Yeah. So the whole thing about this, about the Cult of Personality, the writing of Cult of Personality was such a incredible process, because we wrote the song. That's myself, Will Calhoun, Corey Glover, Mus Skillings. We wrote that song in one rehearsal session. So, you know, normally during a rehearsal, we would go over all the different songs we were doing, because we became regulars at CBGB's. And, you know, I had a loft. We had a loft at 1102 Broadway in Brooklyn. And it was really right under the elevator, the J tracks. And it was kind of like you go down Broadway, and then you go over the Williamsburg Bridge, and you hit Bowery, and you make a right, and it's like a few blocks, and you're right at CBGB's, you know. And that's how we used to do it, you know. And CBGB's, we kind of became a laboratory for us, because Hilly started booking us regularly, and we started building a local audience, and we would introduce songs, take songs out, you know, change songs up, you know. And this one rehearsal, Corey was trying to sing, and I can, for the life of me, I couldn't play you the original thing that Corey sang, but it was something, you know, and I was just like trying to figure out what he was singing, and then I played, and just this one phrase, and from that point of playing that one riff, it was, I don't know, man, because I had the one riff, and I felt immediately that the riff had something to it. It had something to it. And I said, and I remember yelling, "Will, play a beat to this," you know? So he, and we were just playing the first part of this riff, and he's playing this boom, pat, boom, boom, sack, you know, beat to it. And I don't know what made me, and then Mud started playing along, and then I was like, okay, there's enough of that. You know, it was kind of like, okay, that's cool, but we can't just do that, right? And then I was kind of like, I think I might have stopped. I was like, you know what I mean? It was just like I mean, this is basically a kind of, if you're thinking of it in modes, it's like a G mixolydian. It's basically, you know, not to get technical about it, but it's a riff based on a G7 and a G6 chord. And basically those notes, you know, it's basically, it's like the notes of the C major scale, but you start on G, blah, 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 whatever that is, right? But it was kind of
standard rock approach.
Yeah. So, and really the thing was kind of like a call. I thought of it as a call and like a da 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 ba ba da, like almost like the riff was a conversation with the, you know, da 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 da, and you know, and it's kind of like, you know, Santana had this song called Marbles. You know, he had like, so it was kind of, wasn't thinking about marbles at the time, but it was also thinking about this kind of mode, you know, the Mixolydian things and the Lydian things. I mean, that was showing up a lot in fusion, in jazz rock fusion. So, you know, that was kind of the, you know, so I was like, wait. And then I was like, okay, what's the next bit? What's the next bit? And I mentioned Raymond Jones, and you know, Raymond had this really cool thing about the way he was really influenced at some point by Todd Rundgren and that kind of voice leading, you know, and I was like, I was almost like kind of like trying to I was like sort of, well, what would Raymond, you know what I mean? I think I thought,
Tender.
I was like, what would Raymond play here, right? And it was kind of like, so, and then I went to this, to the B flat, and it was kind of like arpeggiating the descending chord. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it's kind of the cycle, and it just felt like it felt right. And then, you know, and I had the other thing part of it was lyrics, right? So we're working on this, you know, working on the rhythm, working on the parts, you know, and I had this red notebook, and it's such a sad story about Red Notebook of Dreams. I had this red notebook that I put all my lyrics in, and I for some reason I wrote this poem, and I wrote the poem because it was kind of, you know, we were all, you know, children of, you know, the Cold War, right? Cold War, mutually assured destruction and all of that, right? So the Cold War, you know, thinking about all of that, and we were also, we grew up with war movies, you know, World War II things, and there were all these kind of, I mean, they were big, you know, we lived in the 20th century through the great man thing, right? It was about, so history is made by, you know, it's totally sexist, right? But history is made by great men. So this parade of dudes that everybody talks about, right? That everybody, you know what I mean, for good and ill, right? And I thought, you know, there's something about raising, you know, a person up to the status where they're iconic, where there's something that unifies good, and there's something between good and evil. There's something that they have in common, and that's what the premise of the poem was, you know. And I made a decision to use Mussolini instead of Hitler because I didn't want to have his name in one of my songs, right? You know what I mean? And talking about Gandhi, Mussolini, but also having, you know, the original sample was Martin Luther King. Free at last, thank God Almighty, we're free at last. And then when we were recording it, we couldn't get the rights from the King Foundation. And I was bummed. I was walking through Harlem, and there was a brother with these tapes, and he said he had Speech to the Grassroots. And I heard, during the few moments that we have left, we want to talk right down to earth in a language that everybody here can easily understand. I was like, that's it. And weirdly enough, interestingly enough, my girlfriend at the time, well, that's a longer story, with Malak Shabazz, you know, when, you know, and she actually used to come to see us play at CBGB's, you know. So it was a confluence of, and and there's so many twists and turns. We kind of wrote the song in this one rehearsal. We played it the very next show at CBGB's, and people instantly were freaking out over this tune. They loved it instantly. When we went into the studio, again, you talk about prog rock, those chords in the bridge, it was kind of almost like a Yes thing. Like we used the bridge chords as an instrumental intro. We da, 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 and we had a break, and then we play the sample and then go into the riff. And our producer Ed Stasium was like, forget the intro, just play the sample and play the riff. So the whole time until we made the record, we had this kind of intro thing, and then block the sample, and then we played the heavy riff. And he said, just get to the riff. And after I said, oh, really? And I said, okay. So that's how people, the song was totally different when we played it live. It was totally different. And it was Ed said, no, man, the intro's cool. Just save that for the bridge, So and that's how it went through all of these twists and turns. And it was just, again, a reflection of all the twists and turns that it took for there to be a living color. In a way, I was really imprinted by playing with the Decoding Society. Like the first name, it was Ronald Shannon Jackson and the Decoding Society. And when I started this group, I started out with like the Vernon Reid trio, and it was really all instrumental. And then I said, I want to come with a name. I said, oh, Living Color, right? Because color TV, whatever, Living Color. And then it was Vernon Reid's Living Color. And the only reason it was like that is because I was following the example of Shannon, right? And at a certain point, I was like, that's too much. I don't want to do that. So I dropped it, and it became Living Color at that point. So it was all these things. At first, the first things I was doing were half instrumental, and I started the actual first Living Color song is Funny Vibe, right?
Right.
Funny Vibe is actually the first Living Color song. Like I Want to Know is a song that I wrote when, I was in a band for a brief time with Raymond Jones, put together like this kind of progressive, again, like, kind of like a Peter Gabriel, Stevie Wonder type of thing, right? Really prog, it was cool, right? And I wrote that song when I was in that band. That band broke up, and I had the song, and I brought that song into Living Color. But that was originally a song for a band called 1 a.m. It was my original for that thing, but I brought it in. So all that to say, at one point I was doing half instrumental and half vocal things. And I had a really, he's passed on, like so many great people, like Raymond Jones and so many people who influenced me and helped me have passed on. But there was this photographer named Stephen Critchlow, and I used to play at the 55 Grand Bar. And I ran into him on the street, and he pulled me over. He said, yo, man, I was at your last gig. And he said, you got to make up your mind. You got to make up your mind. You're playing this one music, then you're playing this other music, and I'm confused. It's like, I don't know. So then I was like, and I just was, it was kind of mine, because he really went out of his way to say that, man, what you doing? And then I said, I'm gonna take all the vocals, because I was uncomfortable singing anyway. So I said, I'm just gonna do an instrumental thing, right? So the next gig I did that, and I was in a band with Jessica Hagedorn, the great Philippine American poet, and she was bummed. She said, why'd you take out those songs? Right. And because he said, why'd you take those songs? I was waiting to hear them. And I was like, oh wow. So then I just kind of flipped. I said, oh, maybe I should do the other thing. And I'm kind of self-conscious and anxious person somewhat. So I was playing these, it was a trio, and I did all these crazy gigs, man. I opened for the Art Ensemble of Chicago at Irving Plaza. I opened for the first Fishbone show at Irving Plaza. Man, it was a crazy time. But I remembered I met this dude at my sister had dragged me to a birthday party with a friend, and I met this guy. Well, anyway, my middle sister is a really kind of classic, like conciliatory middle child. But I had been on this really long tour, and it was the tour that had me decide to leave the Decoding Society. And and strike out on my own. It was crazy. But anyway, I came home. I've been gone 6 weeks. And she said, "You're coming with me to this party. We never do anything. I never see you," and blah, blah, blah. She drags me to this party, and it's one of her girlfriends, and the party is packed, and it was time to sing Happy Birthday. And it's still the only party I've ever been to where the room was packed, but only one person sang Happy Birthday, and it was Corey Glover.
Oh, wow!
And I said, man, and he sang the heck out of it, and I was like, "Yo, man, you have a really nice voice." And he said, "Oh, thank you," and I took his number. And at a certain point, I was like, I can't hack the singing and playing the parts. I was an early shoegazer, so I gave him a call.
I hear you. I'm bummed because we're running tight on time. But you brought up so many interesting things, and when you were referencing cult of personality and the use of samples and the speeches from Malcolm X, the song takes on a bigger meaning, and in that Afrofuturist sense, the song sort of reaches into the past to contemplate what a liberated future, free from exploitation, could look like. And, you hear so many different styles of this messaging, I guess, in the music that emerged from the, in the 80s, and I'm thinking of a lot of hip hop too. And I'm upset that we don't have time to get into your collaboration with Public Enemy, but I guess we'll save that for the next talk. But
I guess you will.
I do have a few questions from the audience that I'd love to try to get through. Melanie was asking if she could hear some of your thoughts about music as a vehicle for social justice and healing.
Okay, so music as a vehicle for social justice and healing, the music has to come first. The music has to come first, and the message, whatever the message is, if the music is working, then the message will work. But the music has to work first. And I mean, it's like the reason of What's Going On is an iconic record is because Marvin Gaye was processing what happened to his brother Frank. His brother Frank went to the Vietnam War and came back different, and it was a really personal connection that had that music. If you want to be universal, you have to be specific. That's the thing. You're not going to be everything to everybody, but if like Midnight Oil can talk about things that are specific to Australia and still resonate across the boundaries, so that's what I think it is. It's got to work as music. Public Enemy works as music, and then the message comes through. I mean, Black Seal in the Hour of Chaos is an incredible piece of music, and that the line is I got a letter from the government the other day. I opened and read it. It said they were suckers. That's what it's it's the music, and then the message with the music. You can have all the great intentions, but if the music's not working, then it's not working.
Gotcha. Kinshasa was saying how can one man live in all of this history? Each artist is another story, a tree with many branches, living color. Did you feel that you were making history, or were you just making music?
I was just living my life. We were living our lives, and I'll tell you what was heavy. There have been many people, a bunch of different people. The first trio was Alex Mosley and Greg Carter. Alex Mosley on bass and Greg Carter on drums. And most people, if they're a fan of Lisa and the Cult Jam, the dude called Spanador, that's Alex Mosley. And he had left the band, and it was a long story. But we stayed cool. And he walked up to me at a convention and said to me, "Y'all made history." And I was like, "What you talking about?" He said, "No, man, for real." Like he said, "No, man, y'all made history with this." And it's a weird. I hold it all really lightly because I think about, this makes me think. I have to mention, my brother that just passed, Greg Tate, so much of the underpinnings of the aesthetic that when from back in the days, he had such a mind, and he made all of these kind of connections between what was happening in the past and how it informs the present and how it's going to inform the future. And he really, really, in his writing and in his music as well, he brought that home. It's a great question. Thank you for that.
Sure thing. I guess just thinking about your start with the band coinciding with your work to develop the BRC out of New York City, and how amazing it is that so many like-minded musicians, artists, intellectuals, we're all there at the same place, and it's not just a scene. There is this kind of, dedicated purpose to collectivize, to form an institution. And it's very reminiscent. I believe you mentioned the Association of the Advancement of Colored Music.
AACM, the Association for the Advancement of Creative Musicians.
Right. And, in that mission to be the musical voice of the Black Power movement, what were some of the factors and inspirations, I guess, and we don't have much time, but what were some of the factors that brought you guys together to form the Black Rock Coalition?
I mean, it was like, it was kind of like a gut check and like, am I crazy? That's basically, it was really about, Melvin had started a band called I&I, and his band was amazing. It's the first rock band. It's the first rock band to have a DJ as a regular member, DJ Logic, who was 17 years old. And I went to see one of his gigs, and the gig was empty. And then we were struggling. And then I knew of this band, this all-female band called ISIS, and they were struggling. And I just started calling a bunch of, my friends. I started calling people and said, yo, let's get together. And we got together over at Linda Bryant's, just above Midtown Gallery. It was on Spring Street. And no, it was on Broadway, just above Midtown Gallery. And I just said, yo, is it me? Is it me? And he said, no, it's not you, it's a thing. And then we started meeting, and it was like it was just kind of like, the idea wasn't to start an organization. The organization came out of a bunch of like-minded people. Like, what are we going to, and I remember I think it was Greg Tate said, well, what are we going to do about it? We met about 3 times, and it was a great social occasion. And it was like, he was like, yo, man, so what are we going to do? So it's like, so the way it ran is like, it was like, I made the initial phone call, but it was Greg that said, what are we going to do? And then it was Craig Strait that came up with the name, because we said, let's call it the Black Rock Collective. He said, that sounds like communism. The Black Rock Coalition. And that's how it was all, how that happened. And Conda Mesa was in that group, and Flip Barnes was in that group early on. And that's how it started.
Gotcha. Well, Vernon, I want to thank you once again for taking the time to chat with me and to discuss your music, discuss your ideas about music and everything else with all of us. And I want to thank all the viewers who've been with us tonight, and of course, thank the Smithsonian Afrofuturism series. I also want to remind viewers that we'll start again at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time tomorrow with a panel on cyberspace. But Vernon, thanks again. We really appreciate it.
Kevin, thank you for having me. I want to thank everyone that checked this out. And man, the future is unwritten, and we just got to make sure that we're in it.
Yes, indeed. Thanks so much, Vernon.
Peace.